disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Janice Marie Hunt, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Sunday, March 15th, 2026 issue of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. The Oscar for Worst Casting goes to, unfortunately starring, A Dude Lost in Space, Matthew McConaughey, a prosthetic rap performance, Tom Hanks, a mad dad, Glenn Powell, an all-business love interest, Daisy Edgar Jones, a bloodthirsty blonde, Tom Cruise, a high school senior, Ben Platt, a resilient pickpocket, Cameron Diaz, a lover and a fighter, Leonardo DiCaprio, a warrior with feelings, Paul Mescal, an ex with an ever-changing accent, Blake Lively, an unmusical madam, Michelle Yeoh, a normie husband, Robert Pattinson, a chipper shrink, Rami Malek, a scene stealer to a fault, Jack Black, scheming Italian fashionistas, everybody. This year, there's a new Oscar category for Best Casting. We'd like to celebrate miscasting instead. Bobby Cannavale is packing kids' lunches. It wasn't long ago that Bobby Cannavale knew nothing about bearded dragons. But after his 8-year-old son Raphael professed a wish for one, he boned up on their care. You have to feed them live crickets, but then you have to also feed the crickets, he said from Brooklyn, where he lives with Rose Byrne and their other son Rocco 10, and Cannavale 55 was the talk of the internet for a moment after Byrne said her Golden Globe acceptance speech that he missed the awards because he was at a reptile expo picking up the new family pet. Cannavale stars in Amazon Prime Video's Scarpetta, in which he plays a former detective. He shared his cultural essentials. These are edited excerpts. The Bootleg Series, Volume 18, Through the Open Window, 1956 to 1963. I've been a Bob Dylan fan since I was around 20. I find him lyrically to be a wizard. It's interesting to follow him when he's a young man and is beginning his interest in old folk songs, and then watching him transition into the writing of his own folk song, Blowing in the Wind. Heated rivalry is something I would never think to put on, but I just had too many actor friends tell me, you've got to see this Connor Story kid, he's amazing. It's not often you get to see a sports genre show that involves the LGBTQ positive characters. The New Yorker Home Delivery. I'm subscribed online, but in an effort to stay off my screens, I wasn't reading it enough, so I said, you know what? I'm going to start getting it delivered to the house again, even though I still had PTSD from not being able to catch up to all the New Yorkers that were piling up. I'm doing pretty good. I'm only one behind, but every Thursday I start to sweat a little bit. Packing lunches for my sons. I've always been a morning person, so I naturally get up early before the kids. I'll put on the daily and make my sons' lunches. I love it, just trying to think. What are they going to enjoy today? I'll write them little notes. It makes me feel like I'm transferring some part of myself to them as they go out into their day. Edgar Allan Poe stories. I loved reading these when I was a kid, and I like reading them to my children now. They're just so well constructed. They start in one place and go to another that you didn't see coming. And there are all kinds of thrilling things that happen along the way. Working out. I try to go to the gym 5 times a week. It's so good for me mentally. I'm able to be in my head without any sort of external forces forcing their way in, whether that's other people in the street or the phone competing for my time. Seeing the animals at the Nature Company. I found this amazing place down the road from me in Brooklyn, and I've become obsessed with them. They do parties for kids and they bring reptiles to schools as part of a program for kids who don't spend time with animals. My beardie is the first pet I've ever had, so I have lots of questions. I'm there twice a week. They're my reptile geek squad. Mark Krigel's sports biographies. He reminds me of these sports writers from another time, like Jimmy Breslin or Pete Hamill. He wrote this incredible biography of Joe Namath that made me have a new appreciation for the Jets as an organization. Surratt. I watched this movie 3 weeks ago and I still think about it every day. It's an incredible meditation on the shared experience of grief and how people you don't even know can save your life. Making the perfect sandwich. It's all about the bread. For my money, the best baguette right now is at L Apartment 4F in Brooklyn Heights. They make an everything bagel seeded baguette that is not to be believed. When I was doing Only Murders in the building with Marty Short, he's another sandwich aficionado. I start this habit of sending him pictures of my sandwiches. Sometimes I get a thumbs down, like when I did fried fish with some, I should get rid of this leftover pastrami on top with some pickles and some sauerkraut and spicy German mustard. It was pretty explicit. Good, I have to say. Heirs draw a line and take control of an artist's legacy. Fred Stewart and his cousin Todd Miner walked on the winter-browed turf of a cemetery here graced by a few glooming cedars and leafless oaks searching for the grave of Mike Desfarmer, a photographer who opened a portrait studio in this small town in the Ozark foothills around 1915. Desfarmer was a solitary bachelor who was said to like ice cream, his fiddle, the occasional beer, and little else. After, by most accounts, renouncing his relatives, he died here in obscurity in 1959, only to be acclaimed in the 1970s as a great artist. It took Stewart less than half an hour to locate the simple carved granite stone he and Miner were looking for. "Todd," he shouted to his cousin across the way, "I found Uncle Mike." It was another step to reclaiming their ancestral heritage. In late January, Stuart Miner and 91 other distant relatives of the farmers had celebrated the settlement of a 6-year legal dispute that pitted them against the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts Foundation to determine who controls the archive and copyright and ultimately the legacy of the artist who died without a will. Although the specific terms are confidential, the agreement between the family and the museum left the heirs in apparent possession of the copyright and of about 3,000 of Desfarmer's glass plate negatives and hundreds of posthumous prints made from them. On February 25th, the first family authorized exhibition of the artist's work, Desfarmer. The Homecoming, with 9 prints, opened in the rotunda of the Arkansas State Capitol, where it will be on view through late May. Art scholars and experts on intellectual property law say the litigation over Disfarmer's archive poses consequential ethical and legal questions, among them who should manage the estate of an artist who dies without a will, heirs who hardly knew him, or outsiders, including museums who built and conserved the estates that are now worth fighting over. The Disfarmer litigation raises some of the same issues, and indeed involves some of the same players as the lawsuits initiated by families of two other recluse American artists who died without wills, Vivian Maier and Henry Darger, who both lived in Chicago. All three were unrecognized during their lifetimes and out of touch with their relatives. When their estate belated became vulnerable, distant cousins stepped up to demand their rights. The law would dictate the outcome, but some question whether the law always serves as an artist's best interest. Heirs are a mixed bag, said Christopher John Springman, a professor of law at New York University and an expert on intellectual property and copyright law. Sometimes heirs are really concerned with artistic legacy and are well advised and work to expand public recognition of the person they're inherited from. Sometimes they're just not. Hailed as a virtuoso. Beginning around 1914, Disfarmer began to photograph members of his community who brought his portraits for as little as 25 cents. For the most part, his customers were struggling farm families, evidenced by their homemade clothing and weathered, stoic faces. Along with a mastery of lighting and composition, Disfarmer possessed that rare and mysterious talent of a great portrait photographer, the ability to coax his subjects to drop their mask and reveal themselves genuinely to the camera. Ever since Disfarmer's photographs were discovered by the art world in the mid 1970s, his achievement has been shrouded or packaged in tales of his eccentricities. There was such a mystery around Disfarmer, which the world of photography loved, said David Company, creative director of the International Center of Photography. I remember seeing the first book of Disfarmer's work and being struck that it was on a line between something austere and clinical and something empathetic. It seemed to be on a really interesting knife edge. Born Mike Maier in Indiana in 1884 to German American parents, the photographer repudiated his family tie and changed his name to Disfarmer in 1939, explaining in a petition that he wanted to spare the family any anxiety that he might attempt to inherit and share a portion of their wealth. He chose the name Disfarmer, believing that Maier meant farmer in Germany. Disfarmer believing that Maier meant farmer in German. More precisely, it refers to a farm overseer. Disfarmer died at 75, leaving behind thousands of negatives and a bank account of $18,148.80, worth about $200,000 today, that was divided 6 ways among his siblings or their heirs. The estate's administrator sold his lot of negatives for $5 to a former mayor of Heber Springs, who later sold them for $1 to Peter Miller, a newspaper editor and lawyer in town. Some of the some of the emulations of the glass plates which registered the images had been eaten by bacteria. Miller restored the salvageable plates and sent a selection of prints to Julia Scully, the editor of Modern Photography in New York. In 1976, the pair published a book of 66 portraits to rapturous reviews. In the New York Times, the critic Jean Thornton wrote that the photographs can stand comparison with the works of August Sanders, Diane Arbus, and Irving Penn. Richard Richard Avedon said the book was indispensable. Suddenly, this farmer was no longer a forgotten small town practitioner. He was a great artist. On June 8, 1977, an industrious commune in Arkansas called the group, which had received the bulk of this farmer's negative plates from Miller, donating them to the Arkansas Arts Center Foundation, which became the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts Foundation, the subject of the recent lawsuit. The, the photography market generally awards much greater value to prints overseen by the artist than to those produced in 2004 and 2005. Dealers from New York hired local canvassers to buy up photographs that this farmer had sold in his lifetime that were now hanging on residence walls or glued in scrapbooks, while prints made later from his negatives sold for around $1,500 or less. His vintage prints could fetch 10 times that amount or more. Vintage prints are in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Getty Center in Los Angeles, and the Whitney Museum in New York. Scattered throughout Arkansas and as far away as California, this farmer's descendants knew nothing of his preposterous celebrity until Ron Slattery, a Chicago buyer and seller of the sort in flea markets, texted Miner on August 27, 2019, and asked to meet with him. Slattery and Fawn Slattery, who was then his wife, had a passionate interest in the question of who inherits the estate of an artist dying without a will. In several phone interviews with the Times shortly before his death this year, Slattery said that the couple had been driving around the country that summer when Fawn, a photography collector, saw a friend had posted a disfarmer photograph on the internet. When she called up other images, she was perplexed to find that disfarmer's photos were all credited to Peter Miller or the group. They had owned the negatives, but why did they control the reproduction rights? Under copyright law, the owner of photographs and negatives can display or sell them, but the authority to make prints or reproduce the rest with the photographer or the heirs. I said to Ron, "This is not right," Fawn recalled in a phone interview. I went on the genealogy site for this farmer, and within 20 minutes I found his family tree and family members. Miner met them the next day at a diner near his home in eastern Arkansas. Miner's paternal great-grandmother was this farmer's sister. From his father, Jimmy Miner, a country music singer-songwriter, Todd Miner had learned he had a great uncle Mike who was a photographer. I never thought anything about it, he said, adding that after his father died in 2009, he found some of his uncle's photographs in his papers. I've been researching him ever since. Miner said that, contrary to prevailing belief, this farmer had been close to his sisters and nieces until a acrimonious probate dispute led him to change his name. Our perception of him is a little off from what people think he said. He was eccentric, yes, but not so extreme. The Slatterys rode around Arkansas with Miner, visiting members of this farmer's extended clan. None knew of his eminent reputation, and many suspected a scam. At one meeting, a burly cousin threw a Polaroid of a dead rattlesnake on the table and said to Ron, "This is what we do to snakes in Arkansas." But over time, most relatives were persuaded to enroll in this Farmer Family LLC. They succeeded in reopening the estate in 2021. A year after they retained a lawyer, 3 years later, having failed to reach agreement with the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts on ownership of the negatives that initiated a lawsuit. While researching this farmer, the Slatterys read an article by Elissa Westby, a law student, that questioned the management of the estate of Henry Darger, an outsider artist who was known as a social misfit. In his two-room apartment in Chicago boarding house, Darger, who earned a living as a hospital janitor, created a gargantuan opus, illustrating with watercolors, drawings, and collages an epic tale of conflict between a legend of little girls, many of them portrayed naked with penises, and a brutal horde of adult marauders. After Darger became too infirm to stay in his apartment, his landlords Nathan and Kyoko Lerner moved him to a nursing home and took possession of a trove of his paintings and writings. Once again, the Slatterys conducted genealogical research and identified Darger's relatives, learning they were cousins of the artist and that the paintings by Darger had sold at auction for prices as high as $745,000. The Darger descendants banded together. One of them, Kristen Sadowski, was appointed as supervisor administrator of the estate in June 2022. The heir sued Kyoko Lerner, the widow of Nathan, to acquire possession and copyright of the art. The lawsuit is ongoing. The Slatterys said they have not benefited materially from either dispute. Fawn, a retired psychiatric nurse, said, "Both artists, and this is what made me angry. They said they were crazy. I thought that's not right. It stuck in my craw." Ron's devotion to the subject dated to 2007 when he purchased unclaimed boxes auctioned in Chicago. They were found to contain the prints and negatives of Vivian Maier, a street photographer who made her living as a nanny in metropolitan Chicago. Maier, like this farmer and Darger, drew little notice during her lifetime, but attained preposterous fame thanks to her chief promoter, John Maloof, a young real estate broker who acquired most of her negatives and unprocessed film at auction and by purchase from Slattery and others. Although Maloof said he had acquired the copyright from a distant cousin of Maier who lived in France, that man was not a legally declared heir. In 2014, David Deal, an enterprising Virginia attorney, located another removed but closer Maier cousin and filed a petition on his behalf. That led Cook County, Illinois, 5 years after Maier's death, to probate the Maier estate and assigned it a public administrator, until the question of heirship is resolved. The next hearing is scheduled for later this month. Slattery argued that the rights to work by an artist who dies without a will should go to the closest surviving relatives. It's about legacy, he said. How dare you take the legacy from them? Others make the case that while outside partners like Miller and Scully, in the case of Disfarmer, or the Lerners and Mayloft, may profit from their investment in these artists, they also work diligently and successfully to advance their artist's reputation, bringing to public attention to the estates that are now worth fighting over. Chelsea Springman, an independent curator who organized a Disfarmer show at the Newburgh Museum of Art in 2014-2015, said copyright laws can be harmful when they automatically renew heirs with the rights without asking. What is beneficial to the culture at large, detrimental to cultural preservation. In the case of the Disfarmer estate, she said, what's at stake is the work not being accessible and not being preserved. She added, I'm surprised after this much time that the family would be rewarded with these rights. The Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts argued in a court filing in 2021 that it has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to restore and preserve the negatives, many of which, when received, were in various stages of decay and decomposition. In an email statement after the settlement, Victoria Ramirez, executive director of the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts, said that since 1977, the Museum of Fine Arts said that since 1977, the museum had housed and cared for the glass plate negatives and ensured that the materials and archives were preserved and maintained intact as a cohesive body of work for historical purposes. Disfarmer's heirs have ambitious plans to promote his legacy, Stewart said. A larger exhibition of prints in the state capitol is scheduled for fall. Stewart is also considering creating a studio like Disfarmer's where visitors could have their picture taken in vintage clothing. Heber Springs really wants to do it, but there would be more tourists than Little Rock, he said. He seems elated to have acclaimed the illustrious photographer as a family member. How Disfarmer would feel about rejoining the Mayors is, of course, something no one will ever know. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Arts and Leisure section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Vying to cast big roles as the process changes. The casting director, Kim Taylor Coleman, used to call the Los Angeles block where her office was located the Street of Dreams. That's because there were 8 to 10 casting directors stationed in one Wilshire Boulevard building. You could walk out a series regular, Taylor Coleman said on a video call. Your life could change. Taylor Coleman is a governor of the casting directors branch of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, along with Richard Hicks and Deborah Zane, who both also used to have offices in that same building. They would see actors rehearsing lines for one audition and drag them in to read for a different part. Now, while all 3 are still on the job, only Hicks remains in that spot, and the Street of Dreams has largely moved online. That's one of many changes over the years, including the rise of self-taping and the impact of social media that has greatly affected how actors land jobs in Hollywood. Back in the day, you kind of had to be in the room in LA, Zane said on the same call. But in the pandemic, when it was unsafe to hold auditions in person, self tapes in which actors filmed themselves auditioning and Zoom meetings became the regular these days. While many casting directors in Hollywood still hold auditions in person, there's generally less FaceTime. The pros are we can see more people, Zane said. But the cons are also that you can't smell people anymore. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? It was great to see people in person as their profession is thrust into the spotlight with a new Oscar for their work being awarded on Sunday. The casting directors I spoke with acknowledged that the digital migration of their process has, in some ways, globalized the experience. They can look further afield than ever before, but they also acknowledge that sometimes a human touch is lost. Before, you would never do a chemistry read on Zoom. You would find a way. The Marty Supreme casting director Jennifer Vendetta told me. She said that with chemistry reads, auditions to see if two actors vibe, she has still tried to argue for in person sessions, but sometimes it's just not possible. I just did a TV show and we couldn't, and we did it on Zoom, she added. Wow. The changing dynamics of casting became a hot topic during the 2023 strike of the SAG AFTRA, the Actors Union. Self tapes, in particular, were a point of contention, in part because of the amount of money performers felt they needed to spend on high quality gear and even coaching to make sure their work would get noticed. The Los Angeles Times reported in 2023 that some actors were paying around $40 a half an hour for services to give them an advantage, and one casting office was renting out its space for $130 an hour. Duncan Crabtree, Ireland, chief negotiator for the Guild, told IndieWire before the union negotiations that it was looking for rules and regulations around how self tapes are used to ensure that members aren't asking to do things that are inappropriate. That self tapes aren't the only method being considered for projects, and that there is still a place in the industry for live auditions and for live virtual auditions where there's real time feedback. Rules were ultimately established that standardized the amount of time actors had to prepare and stated that an actor would not be required to use the specific equipment or editing software. Wow. Bernard Telsey, who cast the Wicked movies and the Hulu series Only Murders in the Building, said he loved self tapes because it allowed him to see vastly more people. He said, for instance, that without a self tape, he would have never been able to cast Marissa Bold as Narissa Rose in The Wicked. We were specifically looking for someone to be Cynthia Erivo's sister who can sing and act and is in a wheelchair, he said. And those are not people who can show up at 1010 on 52nd Street just because I'm putting out an ad for 2 weeks from today. Telsey said he understood that the lack of personal contact could be difficult for actors, but he and his team are watching the submitted auditions. I don't want anyone wasting their time, said the one battle after another casting director, Cassandra Kuklanuts. I don't want actors to send these tapes into the netherworld and never hear back. I try to give feedback on every single tape that we watch so that they are not alone and we can keep their spirits up. She also stated that she worried that actors were putting too much energy into making self tapes perfect, doing too many takes, and ignoring what might have been great in a more relaxed setting. Venditti, however, noted that just because an actor might do a great self tape didn't necessarily mean they could handle the requirements of a role. Now, I try people in many different situations, she said. Then again, Odessa Ozayan's intense tape performed in an actual phone booth for a scene set there in Marty Supreme was so impressive that A24 released it online. Allison Jones, the veteran casting director responsible for Weapons, has also noted studios changing needs based on how they plan to sell their projects. When I started in 1983, it was more about the actor and the performance. And over the years, evolving movies from the studio side have become marketing campaigns, she said. The actress Maya Hawke has said that some directors told her that they need to cast actors who hit a threshold of followers to get their films financed. But Jones, who found now famous newcomers like Freaks and Geeks and The Office, poo pooed the idea that she would ever choose performers based on their Instagram following. Telsey Zane and Taylor Coleman also said they've never been pressured to consider that criterion, while Hicks said he's heard of it happening but has never personally encountered it. If that were true, wouldn't it be Selena Gomez starring in every single movie? Zane said. Doesn't she have more followers than anybody on earth? Taylor Coleman, however, said that she was open to the notion of hiring a performer with a big presence on social media. There's some talent there too, she said. And social media can be a useful tool. It can be posted on Instagram looking for certain roles while also going old school with ads on radio and flyers. For all of the technological advances that have changed casting, they can also be a burden. Hicks said he used to be able to look actors in the eye, give them a note, and have them alter their performance in a way that might help them land the role. With self tapes, it's a much more cumbersome process, he said. It may sound cliche, but it's true. Taylor Coleman said, sometimes there's a magic in the room. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times Art and Leisure section on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. It came from outer space and conquered. In 1976, Parliament Funkadelic debuted its mothership, The Culmination of Myth Empire. Nearly 50 years ago in New Orleans, when George Clinton descended the steps from the huge spaceship he had commissioned for $500,000, the crowd of funk fans at Municipal Auditorium screamed so loudly that he had to hold on to the stage props, rallying to maintain his balance. It felt like I was floating in space when I got out of there, the 84-year-old Parliament Funkadelic ringleader recalled. You just blacked out, you know? The mothership, which made its debut with the P-Funk Earth Tour on October 27, 1976, was the climax of a mythological empire Clinton had been building for 10 years. It all began in Newark with the Parliaments, a doo-wop group Clinton formed while working at a barbershop. After they scored a 1967 hit, I Wanna Testify, Clinton hired more hotshot musicians like the guitarist Eddie Hazel that helped him expand into Parliament and Funkadelic outlets for his acid-influenced musical ideas about Interstellar cartoon space battles. Neil Bogart, the founder of the 70s rock and disco record label Casablanca, signed P Funk around 1974 and helped Clinton secure a bank loan for $1 million to finance the vessel. George created University said Joyce Chabulis, who was married to Bogart, Neil was willing to live in them. He died in 1982. The P Funk universe centered on characters Clinton had established on Parliament's platinum selling Mothership Connection released in 1975, like the superhero Star Child and the evil Sir Knows the Void of Funk, who raged an intergalactic battle over funkinizing the Earth, and Dr. Funkenstein, the mastermind scientist played by Clinton himself. The show illustrated this story with a giant floating denim hat, a skit in which band members steal fitters, headlights, and the hood from a shiny chrome limousine, outrageous costumes, and of course, pioneer funk hits such as Flashlight and Give Up the Funk, Tear the Roof Off the Sucker. The silver pyramid shaped mothership was symbolic too. In Ricky Vincent's 1996 book, Funk, the music, the people, and the rhythm of the one, Vincent likens it to a chariot bringing the chosen to the promised land, a celebration of the infinites of which blacks were now capable. In a recent phone interview, Clinton was more succinct about his ambitions. I was getting ready to take the hood into outer space. Clinton and his latest iteration of P Funk is planning a broader tour this year. With a new mothership, he says, one of the versions has been docked in the Smithsonian since 2011. To mark a half century of his epic creation, we spoke to many responsible for making it. These are edited excerpts from the conversations. Tom Vickers, former Parliament Funkadelic Minister of Information. George came up during the 1960s, and the two main societal forces were the Civil Rights Movement and NASA. George combined both into the whole mothership vibe. He also loved Star Trek. Joyce Tribulus. George invented this, and Neil supported it and financed it. My crazy husband. There was no one else in the industry who would have understood it and paid for it. They'd all go, "That's crazy," and it was. George Clinton. Neil dreamed so big, he was just like myself. We already had the hit record, so instead of paying me, I told him, "Get the mothership," he said. "Oh, hell yeah." Jules Fisher, lighting designer who created the mothership with the stage designer Peter Larkin. I was always trying to get concert people, particularly rock and roll people, to make it more theatrical, not just impressive and big, but some arc to the storyline. Some acts caught on. David Bowie absolutely did. The Stones didn't. They had spectacles. You'd see 1-inch character Mick Jagger walking across the stage. Clinton. I saw hair. I saw West Side Story. Fisher did Broadway shows, and that was the best way I thought to do it. Fisher. I found an airplane hangar, an old military field in Newburgh, New York, where we put it together. It had power, so we didn't have to bring portable electricity. We could hang the mothership in the space and bring all the props in and try them. Fred Wesley, trombonist. We had to rehearse George coming off stage and where the horns and the other members of the band would stand. It went on for about 2 weeks. We hadn't done that before, especially the guitar players and the bass players. They had to get their instruments in the right place. Clinton. We're such a wild group. We ad-libbed and were all over the stage. We had to get used to being chronologically at the right spot at the right time, or those big props would knock you upside the head. We had been so used to tripping all over the place, psychedelically out of the minds, we had to straighten up and get it right. Ivan Neville, singer, keyboardist, and co-founder Dump Dumpstup Punk. I was at the concert in the Municipal Auditorium. I was prepared. I had a bag full of joints that I had pre-rolled. The mothership had a street quality about it. It looked like aluminum foil. It came down and the door opened and there was George Clinton and he came down the stairs. He had a mink coat on. Tim Kinley, Parliament Funkadelic historian, to hide the elevator. It lifted him unseen by the audience into the mothership. They pulled the stairway away. Now the mothership lowers and he can step out and walk down those stairs. This was a magic trick. Vickers. I can't say it was perfect on the first try. A lot of these musicians had to hit marks on stage during different segments of the show. It wasn't terrible, but they were feeling their way through. Silva. The first show I did with them was Houston, October 1976. I was working with Sly Stone, one of the opening acts. The sound of the audience when George Clinton came out of that spaceship was deafening. I never heard or experienced anything like it since. Wesley. The first couple shows were kind of shaky, but that one in Houston, it actually all happened together and everybody did their part exactly right. Clinton. It was like, Houston, we do not have a problem. Kinley. We're talking about a concept series with a developing, overreaching storyline that links all the albums together. Starchild and Sir Nose D. Vodafunk eventually do battle with each other. Starchild shoots Sir Noise with the bop gun, which enables Sir Noise to give up the funk in a flash of light. The mothership is the chariot that holds Dr. Funkenstein. When you see the mothership come down and George Clinton comes out of that mothership during the show, that's supposed to be representative of Dr. Funkenstein coming down to earth and demanding the populace at large to give up the funk. Neville. I was a young, aspiring drugster. Let's say I was smoking the weed and I heard stories about cocaine. I later started messing with that stuff. Thank God I got through that. I'm sober 27 years now, but the idea of the uncut funk, a lyric in the hit P-Funk wants to get funked up from Mothership Connection, that got my attention. Clinton. A fan jumped out of the audience and ran up the stairs one time in Detroit and fell back into the drum riser. I saw years later and he said, I bet I'm the only other person who rode the mothership besides you. Wesley. We would have to get into a town a couple of days early to rig the mothership in Los Angeles. It fell down twice. They had to get a crane to hold it up. It fell so they got another crane. It fell too. The third time, it stayed up. Greg Boyer, P-Funk trombonist beginning in 1978. If you stand at a certain angles, you can see how it all works. Weed was being passed all around the room, so everybody's just like, how the hell did that happen? Being in the band, I was witnessing the guts of the whole operation. Silva. Bootsy's Rubber Band, another opening act starring the P-Funk bassist Bootsy Collins, came on, and I stayed to watch their show backstage. I kept feeling something dropping on my shoulder. It was cold. I realized I was standing directly underneath the mothership. They had this dry ice that used to shoot out of the propeller. Wesley. We had taken the funk to a rock place. Rock during the time had to have costumes and phototechnics. We had all of that. We were the first funk act, black act to do that. We were breaking new ground. Kinley. African Americans had never seen a stage spectacle on the level of the Mothership Connection stage show. What the Who's Tommy was for the white rock fans for the Mothership was the same thing for predominantly African American audiences. He was definitely constructing an alternative universe that had no balance in terms of freedom of thought. In Star Trek, you had one person, Lieutenant Urard, among the entire crew. George upped the ante and said, I want to put all black people in outer space, and he kept doing that. Melissa A. Weber, Tulane University musicologist who performed at DJ Soul Sister. No one had ever thought so big, especially just a few years removed from we're not allowed to be in the same space as white people. Now we're flying motherships across the country. We're filling up stadiums. Clinton and my kids were in New Jersey, and they were going to Muslim schools by the time they got to 15. The whole mothership thing is in the Quran. In a 1996 text, Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan quoted Elijah Muhammad, spiritual leader of the black Muslims, referring to a giant mother plane that is made like the universe. Once the mothership came out and we played Philadelphia, it clicked to me while I was on stage, looking at mostly guys in the front row with the bow ties and the suits on. Then I realized, oh, I may be transgressing. On the live record, you hear me say, ain't nothing but a party, y'all. Kinley, the one in the Smithsonian, is what we call the Club Friendly 90s era mothership. The other one is in a trash heap somewhere, probably in a million pieces somewhere all over Maryland and the DC area. Clinton. The first one, I think, the old promoters sold parts and props, and the museum got pieces of it. I don't even know where it's at. Fisher. Clinton does own the rights to the design. I made a deal. They wanted to own it. I said, fine, it's yours in spirit and heart, and it's yours physically if you sign this piece of paper. It was a contract that my lawyer at the time had made up. Clinton. I can't talk about it, but yes, a new one is going to happen. It's going to be in July. Ooh. I doubt it's going to cost that much this time, but it's going to cost close to it. Play the crossword. NewYorkTimes.com's games. The New York Times games. The New Queens on Broadway. 6, the musical. 6Broadway.com. Broadway Direct. Lena Horne Theater, 256 West 47th Street. The Q. I'm a reporter covering economic policy and immigration in the Washington Bureau. My working life is consumed by politics, so I try to watch shows and movies that don't revolve around the inner workings of government. Here are 5 things I've enjoyed recently. The Beatles Anthology, Singles Inferno, Inverting the Pyramid, Perfect Days, and Ploburus. These are just some of the things that I enjoy that's outside of Washington Bureau, outside of the politics and all of that. Our New Era, New York Philharmonic, 2026-2027 season, sponsored by Lenny and Peter May, starts now. Subscribe now by nyphil.org. Our New Era, the New York Philharmonic. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Sunday, March 15th, 2026 issue of the New York Times Arts and Leisure section. We read from the New York Times Arts and Leisure section every Sunday at 3 p.m. Your reader has been Janice Marie Hunt. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the re-airing of this morning's Buffalo News. Following that at 6 p.m. is the Buffalo News Viewpoints. Stay tuned for this reading and more throughout the day. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability